A shadow, one could say, is simply the dark area produced by some object coming between rays of light and a surface. But for someone like Carl Jung, the shadow signifies a far more literary personification. The shadow is perceived as an entity of its own that is welded and chained within the realm of our deep unconscious mind, a dark specter that we all possess, but also one too frightening for many people to ever build the courage to face. A specter that can never be defeated, but if tamed can lead to personal cultivation and the evolution of the mind and body. But what is the shadow? According to Jung, the shadow possesses the most inferior characteristics of the psyche that all men try to relinquish. The shadow might be a desire frowned upon by our conscience or peers. It could be a bizarre or unhealthy interest that the powers of civilization have apparently quelled. Shadow contents involve known and unknown aspects of the self, making the ego, the unconscious, and the environment all play a role in its expression or repression. When confronted by the ego, the largely unconscious shadow can be integrated into the consciousness. But for the most part, the shadow lies beyond the threshold of human awareness. It is quite within the possibility for a man to recognize the relative evil of his nature, but it is a rare and shattering experience for him to gaze into the face of absolute evil. It is a frightening thought that man also has a shadow side to him, consisting not just of little weaknesses and foibles, but of a positively demonic dynamism. The individual seldom knows anything of this. To him as an individual, it is incredible that he should ever in any circumstances go beyond himself. But let these harmless creatures form a mass, and there emerges a raging monster. And each individual is only one tiny cell in the monster's body, so that for better or worse, he must accompany it on its bloody rampages and even assist it to the utmost. Jung also stresses the importance of externalizing shadow material through socially acceptable channels to bring its inherent darkness to light. The ego is able to integrate rather than repress unpleasant unconscious impulses. When merely repressed, the shadow finds a way through the cracks of the psyche and jumps out in disturbing ways. Given that every human being has a wide variety and range of traits, impulses, and emotions, every individual by necessity has a shadow. Some of these characteristics are repressed and hidden, both to oneself and to others. To oneself so that one can navigate through life with the conviction that one is a wholly good and virtuous human being, and to others so that one can fit and succeed socially. Unfortunately, there can be no doubt that man is, on the whole, less good than he imagines himself or wants to be. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. At all counts, it forms an unconscious snag, thwarting our most well-meant intentions. When one's shadow is relegated to the depths of the unconscious, it can wreak havoc on one's life in the sense that it will exert unconscious control over one's thoughts, emotions, choices, and actions. As Jung said, that which we do not bring to consciousness appears in our lives as fate. This accounts for the self-destructive behavior so many individuals struggle with and are unable to control despite consciously knowing they would be better off not engaging in such actions. The task in life, which thus confronts everyone, according to Jung, is to become conscious of and integrate one's shadow into one's conscious personality, accepting it with open arms, not as an abhorrent aspect of one's life, but as a necessary and vital part of one's being. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The concept of the shadow has been both championed and critiqued among opposing perspectives. Most theologians say we cannot solely rely on ourselves and the limited power of the ego to deal with the shadow. Instead, we must call on the power of God to overcome evil. You can't do it alone. Lean on the Lord, the religious person exclaims. Meanwhile, Jungians warn of a projection trap that some traditional religious person seems to fall into. Jungians tend to say that the sanctimonious individuals in related religious organizations project their own dark impulses onto others instead of facing the evil within themselves. This ugly dynamic may result in scapegoating. Luckily, we have laws in the civilized world to protect people from this kind of primitive mentality. Jung's followers also tend to imply that the spirituality of organized religion possession only goes as deep as the persona, where individuals play a superficial role of holiness for the sake of appearances and to feel good about themselves. This dynamic might account for a Catholic nun's cruel treatment of children, or the horrifying outbreak of pedophile priests and brothers, or the Islamic caliphate that must permeate itself through the East, and the beheadings of all non-believers tolerated and preached by prominent sheiks. The shadow is never faced by the religious man as a result of ignorance. It is falsely assumed by the religious man that the shadow within him is of a foreign entity, an external enemy ceaselessly attempting to pierce through the heart of the righteous and corrupt all good men. The man forgets that the devil itself is not an outsider, but is harbored deep within a dark fortress inside of his own subconscious. Ironically, according to Jung, we may all need to become the exorcists of our innermost demons. Jung says the shadow must be confronted. When repressed, the shadow lurks like an angry dragon locked up in a dungeon, if not sublimated, which simply means the transformation of unwanted impulses into something less harmful. The shadow's sheer power can break free of its chains, causing severe psychological and possibly physical injury. Jung believed that awe-inspiring creativity was conceived once an individual had formed a union or bond with the shadow. The inventive artist who deals with dramatic or foreboding themes, such as the Dutch painter Hieronymus Bosch, creates works of art that provokes a profound feeling of reverence, terror, and bewilderment. Works of art like this are often critiqued by religious fundamentalists and, in the extreme scenario, tyrants like Adolf Hitler. The shadow gripped Hitler's personality, but he wasn't even dimly aware of its hold on him. His perverse impulses were all misinterpreted as righteousness and truth. In his mind, he was the grand chief of a supposed master race, and everything other was to be eradicated. Hitler mediated the power of the shadow with a disturbing charisma that swayed a great number of otherwise ordinary people into committing unspeakable atrocities. That is the power of an untamed shadow synergized with a zealous magnetism. Indeed, Hitler believed that art should be censored for the greater social good and drew up a hate list of so-called degenerate art, entartete Kunst, created by artists whom he didn't like. Picasso's work was on his list, along with that of Gauguin, Van Gogh, Chagall, Klee, Kandinsky, and some other 20,000 other artworks. Ironically, this was the very same Hitler who brutally tortured and murdered innocent civilians and who apparently was a coprophiliac, an infantile condition where one becomes sexually aroused when defecated and urinated on. Truly, the shadow's grasp on him was, for lack of better terms, eerily magnificent. Another way the shadow expresses itself is through parapraxis. Parapraxis are commonly known as Freudian slips of the pen and tongue, brought about by intrusions of an unconscious desire, conflict, or thought. It is like an error in speech or memory or physical action that is interpreted as occurring due to the interference of an unconscious, subdued wish or internal train of thought. Usually socially embarrassing, these slips can nevertheless point to aspects of the unconscious that require further exploration and expression. In confronting the shadow, Jung isn't promoting being pretentious or arrogant. Instead, he encourages awareness and mastery over the powers of darkness. When we must deal with problems, we instinctively resist trying the way that leads through obscurity and darkness. We wish to hear only of unequivocal results and completely forget that these results can only be brought about when we have ventured into and emerged again from the darkness. But to penetrate the darkness, we must summon all the powers of enlightenment that consciousness can offer.